From our studios in New York, this is a special edition of Charlie Rose.
Tonight we continue our journey to the most exciting frontier of science, the brain. Our subject this evening is how the brain controls social behavior. More so than any other species, humans are social beings. We depend heavily on each other for safety, survival, and companionship. Over the course of evolution, humans have adapted not only to a natural world, but also to a social one. Tonight, we will outline the social skills that separate humans from other species. We will learn how the brain reads facial expressions to determine the thoughts and emotions of others. We will ask what science can teach us about empathy and violence. And we will examine how social skills are compromised in the mysterious disease of autism. For centuries, the study of social behavior was left to artists and philosophers. But in the past 150 years, biology has emerged as an important tool for understanding the social brain. Some of the earliest insights into this field were provided by none other than Charles Darwin. He proposed that social traits could be passed down through evolution, much the same as physical traits. Expanding on his theory of natural selection, Darwin argued that emotions are crucial to the survival of the species. Unfortunately, not all of our social behavior is positive. We will also examine tonight the biological basis of violence and aggression. Someday, science may offer hope for understanding antisocial behavior. Joining me this evening, a remarkable group of scientists who have devoted their careers to understanding the social brain. They are Cornelia Bargmann. She studies the genetic control of social behavior in simple animals such as worms and flies. She is also a professor at Rockefeller University. Kevin Pelfrey, his work uses brain imaging techniques to understand social perception and cognition. He is an associate professor of child psychiatry at Yale University. Giacomo Rizzolatti. In 1996, he discovered a special group of cells known as mirror neurons. They are thought to play many crucial roles in social interaction. He's a professor at the University of Parma in Italy. Gerald Fischbach. His research is devoted to understanding autism, a disease that robs victims of their social skills. He is a professor at Columbia University and the director of autism research at the Simons Foundation. And also my good friend and co-host, Dr. Eric Kandel. He is a Nobel laureate, as you know, a professor at Columbia University, and a Howard Hughes medical investigator, and he has been a good friend to this broadcast. We could not do it without him. He has been the person who has linked our curiosity to an extraordinary amount of research and an extraordinary amount of achievement in understanding the brain. So I begin with this question in this episode: social brain. Tell me what we mean by that.
As you pointed out very nicely in your introduction, we are immensely social beings. We use our social behavior to find a partner, to build a family, to build a community, to build our culture. And also, as you indicate, aspects of that can go into disarray and lead to aggression. Social behavior is so important that it is conserved in evolution. And you find it not only in people, but you find it in simple animals, some of which, like ants, build complex societies. Although much of social behavior is learned, important aspects of it are determined by genes. And for example, you can show in flies and in worms and in simple mouse-like animals that single genes control bonding, whether animals will hang together or they go their own way. So genes can have important influences on behavior. Moreover, as you indicated with the social brain, social functions are localized in the brain just as sensory functions and motor functions are. In fact, we see in the social brain that there are sensory areas and the motor areas. In the sensory areas, the visual system is very important. Faces, as you pointed out, extremely important, reading other people's emotions. So there are face areas in the brain that respond not only to faces, but to emotional expression of faces. There are areas in the brain, sensory areas, that respond to the perception of motion. There's one area that responds to all motion. mechanical motion, movement of a car, as well as the movement of you when you're playing golf. There's another area that this feeds into that is specialized just for social motion. It only responds to biological motion, to you playing golf, to somebody walking, to somebody shaking hands. It does not respond to mechanical motion at all. Moreover, as you pointed out, parts of the motor systems are committed to social behavior. Rizzolatti made this wonderful discovery that there are areas in the motor systems that respond when the monkey picks up a glass of water. That's not surprising. The motor system is designed to pick up a glass of water. But the amazing thing is, those same cells in the monkey respond when you, Charlie Rose, pick up a glass of water. So they are mirroring your behavior. So empathic identification with another person is mediated through the motor system. So we've learned all of this by looking at the emotional brain.
Autism. We learn about the brain often through disease. What do we know about autism?
We know that autism is a disturbance in social interaction. We know that its incidence is increasing, in part because we're diagnosing it more. And we know a number of interesting features about autism. For example, kids with autism are inward directed. And when they look at one another, they don't look at the other person's eyes. One of the characteristic features of autism is they turn away from looking at the eyes. So if you look at a normal image, so you look at a normal person and an autistic person looking at the same image, a blonde woman, you see that the normal person focuses on the eyes and the nose. The autistic person casts their eyes downward, does not focus on the eyes, does not focus on the mouth. So you can tell even by watching the eye movements, which is part of the biological motion system, that there is something different in their interaction. But one of the astonishing things about autism is that some small but very interesting fraction of kids with autism are very talented. And they can draw remarkably well. Could we have the next visual, please?
Ah, Nadia.
You know this stuff, Charlie. On the left is a drawing of a horse done by Nadia when she was 5 years old. She could do this when she was 2.5. She couldn't talk. She had very poor social interactions, but she could draw a horse that would jump off the page. I compare this horse to a horse that Leonardo da Vinci did at the prime of his career, one of the greatest artists of all time. You see, her horse is comparable to his. If you take a normal 8-year-old child, they draw a stick figure of a horse. Now, what is so fantastic is Pablo Picasso pointed out there is no precocity in art. So there are many Mozarts. To be a great composer, many kids start composing at a very early age, 3, 4, 5. Mathematicians can start very early. But Picasso claimed you don't get a sense of perspective, of line and shadow, until you're 9, 10, 11 years old. He could not draw a horse like that when he was 5 years old. So despite the fact that they're compromised in some ways, kids with autism can have remarkable strength. And I think that supports a point that is emerging in a number of these programs that Howard Gardner has made, that there are multiple intelligences. You can be very strong in some things and weak in others, and conversely, you can have serious compromise of function and do exceedingly well. And that probably holds for the two of us.
Yes. Especially. This is Charles Darwin's book, The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals. Darwin was amazing to understand.
Amazing man. He was, without doubt, the most important biologist who ever lived. He not only formulated the theory of evolution, but he realized that behavior evolves. Just like body parts evolve, so does behavior evolve. And you can see examples of human behavior in simpler animals. And since emotion is an important feature of behavior, you can see expressions of emotion in animals, and he could detect that. Moreover, he looked around at different groups of people living throughout the world, and he realized that they all have a fixed number of facial expressions, 6 or 7, that express different emotions, and those are conserved. So whether you're living in the Orient or you're living in America, you express emotions in exactly the same way through the same facial expression.
This is an extraordinary idea, and we explore the social brain with our group of experts understanding how this remarkable idea takes place in our brain?
Most animals, most living things, spend at least part of their life in association with others of their own kind. And we know that even in the way we talk about schools of fish or flocks of geese or hives of bees, that groups of animals are often the units that are traveling through time and are behaving together. So they have to recognize each other, they have to communicate with each other, and they have to generate coherent behaviors. And what E.O. Wilson noticed, a naturalist in about the middle of the last century, is that many of the social behaviors that animals have are recognizably similar to each other, related to each other, even in animals that are very different and very widely separated by evolution. And when you make an observation like that in biology, very often what it means is that there's an underlying genetics that's very ancient that is contributing to this same output in lots of different animals. And that idea of taking different genes, but sort of flowing them through the different animals and using them for social behavior in a variety of animals is the idea that builds on the idea that there's a genetics of social behavior. Now, E.O. Wilson himself was not a geneticist, that was not his concern, but the idea grows out of the idea of common behaviors for different animals and the idea of a biology of social behavior.
Fortunately, Corey is a geneticist.
Right.
And she's made a wonderful discovery about genes and social behavior.
So if we could have a movie, I'm going to show you the organism that my lab works on, which is a very simple worm. And this worm is tiny, and it lives in the soil, and it eats bacteria, but it has a number of interesting behaviors, and among those, as shown in this movie, are that it's a friendly worm. And so if we look at a group of worms together, here we see that the two little white worms are associating with about 10 other little black worms, and they're gathered together into a little cluster of animals. And most of the worms want to spend most of their time with other worms, although sometimes one will wander off and come back and join the group. And this is not about food. There's food everywhere, and it's not about mating. This is a family show. It's about the animals preferring to associate with each other.
Now, let me just ask, why do they prefer to be with each other?
Well, they accomplish certain things within the group. They create an environment that's locally better for themselves, and so they're actually solving certain problems in their environment within a group. And that's what animals in general are doing when they create a social environment. So, but sometimes it's a good idea. What you see with most animals is that sometimes it's a good idea to be sociable and sometimes it's not. So for example, during mating seasons or spawning seasons, you might find that animals are together more and other times they're together less. Or you might find that one sex associates more than another. In lots of herding species, the females form groups but the males don't. And what we find in these worms is that we can actually describe the different changes in behaviors based on genes, that some worms are sociable and other worms are more solitary, and we can describe the difference between them based on a single gene that varies between them. Worms that have a high level of activity of the gene will tend to spend most of their time alone. Worms that have a low level of activity will spend most of their time together. So we can actually trace out differences between individuals, not just the overall broad things that everyone shares, but even some of the systems for dialing a behavior up or dialing a behavior down.
We can look at different genes and see how this happens.
Yes.
Or why this happens.
Yes.
Right.
And it turns out that this particular gene is called NPR1, and it's a neuropeptide receptor. And what that is it's part of a system that neurons use to communicate with each other in the brain. It's in particular a system that lets groups of neurons that can be quite broadly scattered coordinate their activities.
Let me move to primates and tell me what we have learned about social interaction among primates.
Well, I think one mechanism which we discovered a few years ago is very important in showing how monkeys interact one to another. And especially this discovery of mirror neurons show that there is a specific way in which the animals, and humans as well, we talk later about humans, have a knowledge of the other. So in other words, there are these neurons which fire both when you observe something or when you do the same thing. So what is strange is this neuron, because the type of knowledge you get from them, it's completely different from that you can get about abstract things. So what you are doing entered inside my brain and it became my behavior. So it's a specific type of link which cannot be substituted by any type of cognitive or inferential thing. So you do something, enter inside my brain as a motor system, and it's my experience. So somehow we share the experience. That's the novelty of the mirror neurons.
Right.
So it's not only a way to understand, because then there are many other ways in which we can understand the behavior of others. But this one has this unique stuff that somehow we share experiences.
You did some mirror neuron experiments with the chimpanzee in 1996.
Exactly. We started in 92.
There it is.
Yeah.
Tell us about it.
So what you see here, you see the behavior of the monkey, orphan experimenter, and you hear the action potential. Action potential are the signal of the brain. So what you have to follow is simply to correlate what is going on the screen and the noise. And you will see that every time the monkey is grasping an object, you hear this action potential. And then the strange thing is when the person will do the same thing, you will hear exactly the same action potential. So it's the same neuron which is triggered either by the monkey grasping or by the person grasping. And it's exactly the same thing. So it's kind of dialogue. You see or you hear or you listen.
So what social traits can mirror neurons account for?
Well, I think this capacity to have a common experience. So the knowledge which mirror neuron provides is a kind of from internal, from my point of view, it's experiential thing. It's not the cognitive. I can understand you. Well, let's imagine that I am in a bar and I am grasping something.
Yes.
Well, I can understand because as a Sherlock Holmes, I am thinking about, oh, well, if he's grasping, probably he will drink. But I can understand immediately, and usually that's what you do,
right,
that I will drink.
Yes.
So that type of experience is shared immediately without any cognitive inference. That's, I think, the novelty of mirror neurons.
Giacomo's discovery of mirror neurons is one of the major discoveries of the last 20 years in neuroscience because it taught us several different lessons. One is, as he indicated, the appreciation that one has in one's brains the capability of understanding another person's action. That when somebody does something, your own nervous system goes off as if you're carrying out the action yourself, although your hand doesn't move. That's number one. Number two, we used to think that the sensory systems and the motor systems are completely separate. This processing of sensory information, your movement, is occurring in his motor system.
Right.
So a fraction of the cells that are involved in picking up this pencil will respond when you pick up your pencil. It's in the motor system that he discovered this remarkable thing. So he made us realize that the motor systems have sensory cognitive capabilities. It's an extraordinary advance.
Okay, but so what are things that mirror neurons allow humans to do that no other species can do?
Imitation.
Imitation.
Imitation. I think, well, there are some evidence that maybe chimps could imitate, but actually we are the only species which are good in imitating. We are the only species, and that's why we have culture. Because what you discovered, I can imitate him, Eric can imitate, and so we have culture. If we're unable to imitate, we have no culture because something discovered disappears. And monkey could not do that. So that's why we think that in monkey this mechanism is not for imitation, but for understanding. And on the top of it, it grows up our capacity.
I think there's a very important issue here. Eric, you used the word understanding, and Giacomo, I know you've written about that many times, beyond imitation, that it's really a signal.
Of the nature of the movement.
It's a signal. What you've discovered is that a correlate, a neural correlate of understanding another individual's action. And I think that goes beyond mimicry. To me, it always has, anyhow, to something very profound about how animals, people can communicate at a very deep level. So I think it's more, to me, it's been more than mimicry.
Also,
and in the context
you can imagine how much learning must go on what is really sort of an implicit mechanism. That is, it doesn't involve motor movements. It's now thought that maybe children learn aspects of language acquisition by seeing their mothers move their mouth, the mother's mouth. The child sees that and learns to do this intuitively. It's really a remarkable insight.
So very much inspired by work in Professor Rizzolatti's lab and others like David Parrott looking at the monkey using single-cell recordings, we're interested now in understanding these mechanisms in humans. And so humans have this ability to socially perceive others, and sort of quite extraordinary, doing this automatically, unconsciously. We look around as we're sitting around this table. We're able to understand the motives of other individuals, psychological dispositions, their intentions, their actions, etc. So we're interested in how do we do this in humans. So these are some areas of the brain that are involved in social perception, and I wanted to highlight one region that we've been studying quite a bit in our laboratory, the superior temporal sulcus region, and put it in reference to, so highlighted here in blue, and put it in reference to two regions that Guaco has talked about in terms of mirror neuron regions, and also a region that processes motion very, very broadly. And so one of the things that we've discovered is that this area here in yellow that responds very strongly to motion, well, it responds to just about any type of motion. Okay, so we showed it 4 different types of motion, 2 biological, 2 non-biological. When I say biological motion, I mean something very simple. Looking at how people are walking, pointing, where you're looking, etc. All of these things are very, very important cues for social perception. So I can understand that where you're looking is where your interest currently lies, where your attention is lying. So this is a brain region that responds strongly to all 4 different types of motion. We showed these same stimuli, the superior temporal sulcus region here, this is showing the brain response, responded strongly to biological motion as compared to non-biological motion. So at this point in the visual stream, the superior temporal sulcus region, it's making this fundamental categorical distinction between what out in the environment is biological, animate, something to pay attention to because it demands a different way of interacting, can provide you clues about social perception versus things that are mechanical. And it's important to emphasize sort of taking this to humans and I think also back into monkeys, particularly when we're talking about imitation. So the way we're thinking about this is, on the one hand, what I'm telling you is that there's this exquisite localization of function for a social processing region here in the posterior superior temporal sulcus, these mirror neuron regions, as compared to a non-social, more general processing region. But we think that these work together. So in a sense, whereas the mirror neurons are representing the action of reaching, they're doing this very interesting simulation type of computation, and they're getting you to mimicry. This information is feeding back into the superior temporal sulcus, which has sort of told these other regions that this is biological versus non-biological motion. And this process is happening whereby this region is integrating the context of that action. So understanding that I'm reaching to a glass, integrating the notion that I might be thirsty, etc. So it gets you to the intention of the action, okay, instead of simple mimicry. And then the last thing I wanted to mention about the superior temporal sulcus, and I wanted to bring us into the area of autism. So one of the fundamental goals of this is to try to understand why children with autism have difficulties perceiving other people's intentions in particular and their actions. And so one experiment we did, we showed children with autism and typically developing kids. So here, children with autism, here typically developing children. We showed them biological and non-biological motion. And you can see in their non-biological motion area, they're responding strongly to both types of stimuli. Both groups of children are responding strongly to all these stimuli. That's perfectly normal, what we see time and time again. And it's suggesting that those children are doing quite complex information processing. From the point of view of a vision scientist, this motion processing area is an extraordinary complex sort of visual pathway in computations. But when you get to the biological motion region, only the typically developing kids are responding to the biological here in red versus the non-biological in blue, differentially. You see that the kids with autism are treating these two stimuli as equal from the point of view of their biological motion processing region.
As we listen every episode to this, I'm hearing certain common themes. One is localization.
Absolutely.
The cutting edge of where brain research is going, and so is understanding where where things are. The other two is sort of this, as we're discussing here, both from genetic and environmental, and where those things come. You know, and the third thing that I find, you know, is how complex all of this is. So that if you really want to go to really understand it, you have to go to begin with genes where you can isolate, and these are commonalities in every conversation we have.
This is why it's so important to have different experimental models. The worm that Corey works on is fantastic in terms of understanding how genes control the logic of neural circuitry, which she has pioneered. Monkeys are terrific because they're the closest things to human. They're non-human primates, so you can study complex things like mirror neurons, which he discovered there. So this is the advantage of having these different experimental animals. Each one can give you a different insight into important biological problem. But there's one other point that I think is important to emphasize. These are very difficult problems, and we're at the beginning in understanding any one of them. So it's really in the last decade or two that the social brain has really emerged in terms of discrete subcomponents.
In the last decade or two. Yeah.
Yes.
The last thing I was going to say, we understand a lot by looking at disease, autism.
Yeah. So Charlie, I think this is also a theme throughout every session of the program, that basic science has taught us a lot about human disorders or predicaments, but conversely, it's the human predicament that has taught us enormously about the basic science of the brain. We talked about this in the very, very first show, and nowhere is that illustrated more profoundly than in autism and related developmental disorders. Autism runs the spectrum between normal behavior and, at the other end of the spectrum, really compromised, severely compromised individuals. I want to begin this brief introduction by talking about Leo Kanner, a man who grew up in Vienna about a generation before Eric did. And,
impossible.
This was in the Paleolithic era. He was born in Vienna and educated in Berlin, and came to this country in 1924. Ended up at Johns Hopkins in the early 30s, and wrote a paper in 1943, very classic paper entitled "Autistic Aspects of Affective Disorders." He didn't title the paper Autism. He borrowed that term from the schizophrenia literature, the inward-looking nature of some people with schizophrenia. They're totally introverted. And I want to read you a few words of his description before showing you a video. In his first paper, he talked about 11 children, and one of them, Donald, he realized was happiest when he was alone, drawing into a shell and living within himself, oblivious to everything around him. Donald had a mania for spinning toys. He liked to shake his head from side to side. All these illustrate some cardinal features of autism. And he liked to spin himself around in circles. And he had temper tantrums when his routine was disrupted. He also noticed that Donald had explosive, seemingly irrelevant uses of words, and that he referred to himself in the third person, and he repeated words, what we now call echolalia, and phrases spoken to him, and he communicated his own desires by speaking about himself in the third person. So it's this notion of the cardinal symptoms of autism being withdrawn from social contact, not taking part in empathetic play, joint play, mutual attention, looking at people and really engaging them by looking in their eyes. But there's also an element of repetitive behaviors, motor functions, which at times are uncontrollable, bordering on the obsessive disorders. And then there are language issues about expression of language beyond the nonverbal communication. Some of this is illustrated in a video that I'd like to show. Actually, there are two parts of a wonderful young boy and his mother. First, at their home they are planning now how to drive to school. And the young boy wants to go one route, and his mother had planned to go a different route. And what you see here is the absolute resistance and the repetitive, almost uncontrolled insistence on sameness, on going this one particular route. Just repeating over and over again that it's Tuesday, he must go in this particular route.
On Tuesday.
Honey, last time, what day will we take her to ball?
On Tuesdays.
Honey, on Wednesday.
Maybe on Tuesdays.
Okay?
Virtual on Tuesday.
We're gonna
Maybe
take Kirchhoff. We're going to take Kirchhoff on Wednesday.
virtual.
Today we're going to take Rosemary Boulevard.
Now, you may say you've seen your own children behave this way, but this is a pattern of repeated extreme behaviors which can be incapacitating. And what I want people to notice here is how wonderful his mother is and how patient and how she works with him. And eventually he will calm down and move on. So it's a difference in degree, perhaps not simply qualitative behaviors. And this is a predicament that many people are facing today. Autism is a remarkably prevalent disorder. The most recent estimates are 1 in 100 children in this country are born. Here she reaches out to touch him and they'll move on. And now you'll see him in the classroom where he's calmer, but the hallmarks of autism are here. He's repeatedly patting his hands, flapping his hands. A child will do that on occasion, but not to the extreme that he does throughout this video. He is not paying attention to what's going on in the front of the room in a classroom. I believe his mother is sitting right behind him, calming him down from moment to moment. Here he's flapping his hands. He's a wonderful, attractive young boy who we hope will improve with time and will become more socialized, but right now is quite withdrawn from everything going on around him.
Give me some whys. Why?
Well, there are many clues to causes of autism, much of it in the last 4 or 5 years. And I think most people, if you approach them, would say that they believe genetics, genes and behavior, that genes play an enormously important role here. I do not for a minute want to rule out environmental factors, but there's one startling fact that everyone has to appreciate, and that is when you look at identical twins, the same genetic makeup, if one of the identical twins has autism, the chances are 90%, 9 out of 10 times, that identical twin will become autistic. There is not any other disorder, heritable disorder, that I know that has that high a concordance between identical twins. And that has convinced many people that the quickest route to understanding autism from a mechanistic point of view will be to focus on the genetics.
If we can identify those genes, then what can we do?
So, Charlie, here's where the challenge is. I just wish the geneticists would hurry up and tell us what these genes are.
Exactly.
And stop
slowing us down.
Stop slowing us down. But everyone knows that when we do that, when we have the genetic landscape,
right,
when we understand what the genetic risk factors are, then we have to find out where in the brain these genes are working, when in the brain they're operative. Is it prenatal during the first, second, or third trimester of birth, or is it in certain critical periods later in development? There's evidence that some autism follows a pattern of regression. Children develop normally for a period of time, although this is a strong debate in the literature. But it may be that there are different critical periods. Autism is not going to be a simple one gene, one disease phenomenon. In fact, the best estimates I know of suggest there may be more than 100 genes that enhance the risk of autism. And they may act at different times in different ways. And that's what the challenge is.
Is the most important thing identifying these genes, or are there other things that we're making dramatic progress in autism, because it is something that I've heard more and more about over the last 4 or 5 years. Now, is that because there are more cases or simply more understanding?
I think the prevalence is increasing. If you look at the graphs, the reported prevalence since 1985 is going up and up. Used to be thought it was 1 in 5,000, then 1 in 1,000, now 1 in 100.
Right.
So if this is a genetic disorder, how can this happen? It may well be that there are certain environmental influences, but I believe, and I think many believe, that there is an increase in the genetic risk. And autism is not inherited in the usual sense. If you think of it, autistic children don't often grow up to have families, large families. So why is it increasing? Why isn't autism decreasing? And the thought is that there is a phenomenon called de novo, new mutations, that happen every generation. When sperm and egg cells are developed, there are mistakes, not mistakes, there are changes that happen where you are a combination of your mother and father. For every protein in your body, you inherit one gene from your mother and one from your father to make up a pair. But that copying function is not precise. You're different from your mother and from your father and from your siblings. And you're different because you don't copy all the DNA exactly. There can be spelling mistakes, or there can even be little pieces of DNA, submicroscopic chunks of DNA, which get deleted or duplicated. So you are different, and we're all different from each other around the table, due largely to these de novo mutations.
Another turn, and talk about aggressive behavior.
To the level of animals, animals have fights, and animal aggression or animal conflict is something that is well organized and has rules. It's a way that animals use to allocate scarce resources. So I'm going to show 2 movies. We've all seen movies on the Nature Channel of elks fighting each other for a female, but these movies will show you that even very simple animals, fruit flies, can show aggressive behaviors. And so these are going to be 2 male fruit flies, and they're going to be fighting over a food supply. So in the first very short clip, you're going to see one fruit fly decide that the other fruit fly has got to go.
All right, the next one?
And then in the second video, we're going to see one male fruit fly decide that the other male fruit fly has really got to go. And I'd like you to watch this movie to get a sense of the clear intention of this fly's action.
What did we learn from this?
You don't want to meet him in the dark alley.
So here's an important thing to learn, is that these are not fights to the death. So when animals have this kind of an argument, there's a winner and there's a loser, and the loser goes off and to try and find another location to find some food. If these were 2 males, they might have been fighting about a female instead of fighting about food. But these are orderly ways of determining who gets to be dominant and who has to move on. And in fact, animals will remember this and they will change their behavior. Even pretty simple animals will remember who they lost a fight to. Fish can figure out that if they lost a fight to this guy and an even bigger guy beat up the other guy, the even bigger guy just don't even bother. So this is a surprisingly logical, intelligent way of working. And there's work in animals has told us something, that there is really a biology, that there are chemicals involved in the memory of being a winner and a loser. And that, for example, serotonin, a neurotransmitter, is particularly involved in correctly recognizing whether you've won or lost an argument. And so again, this is a neurochemical that's present in the human brain. There's some evidence that severe disruptions in serotonin systems cause disruptions in your ability to correctly learn and evaluate a situation where there's a potential aggressive interaction.
Go ahead.
So it's thinking about this, human aggression is much more complicated than animal aggression, again. But you have to recognize when you're working with biology and when you're working against it. And there are situations where aggression is going to be much more common than others. Since aggression is designed around a limiting resource, when resources are limiting, there's going to be more fight, there's going to be more conflict, and that's just going to be a basic rule no matter where you are. Another thing we've learned from animal studies is how greatly aggressive behaviors are modified by stress. So your brain under stress is a completely different brain.
More likely to be aggressive?
Much more likely to be aggressive, much less likely to sort of remember properly what your place in the hierarchy is, and much more likely to lead to conflicts in the future. So these kinds of understanding of the biology can help you to evaluate what the causes of aggressive behavior might be, and how you can go about creating situations where those are more or less likely to occur.
And at some point you get into the very controversial area in which people will suggest that the reason for some aggressive behavior, some obscene behavior, had something to do with biology rather than, and that's where the morality and the ethics and the science, am I right or wrong?
Absolutely.
But humans are complicated. We start from children, we learn throughout our lives what the right way is to act within our environment. We are educated for many years until we encounter each other. And we learn that the football field is an acceptable place to give aggression under well-defined circumstances with protective headgear. And we learn that other situations are incorrect situations in which to display them.
I don't deny there is aggression and also everything which said
in the biology.
In biology. But I think we are born to be good, as a matter of fact.
See, that's the point I wanted to get to. No,
I think we are born to be good. The reason is that because, for example, when we see somebody in pain, we have exactly the same feeling as if we have been in pain ourselves. In other words, we have a mechanism which elicit the same reaction when we are in pain or disgusted because of natural stimuli, or when we see somebody else in the same condition. So seeing him in pain is as if I was in pain. So we have this link between emotion, mine, and the others, which render practically necessary that the other are happy. If the other are happy, I am unhappy. If he is happy, I am happy. So there's a kind of natural biological link that we are born with. Then, of course, during the life, there are many conditions in which that could not be. We can be trained to become not good. But I think we have been born not like Hobbes think, kind of homo homini lupus, but rather we are born to be good. And then it's the society, the stress, and all the difficulty which Corey mentioned that make us to be bad.
Yakima makes a very good point. Reinhold Niebuhr, the great Protestant theologian, once said, "The capability of people for good makes democracy desirable. The capability for evil makes democracy necessary." Right. That is, social,
very good point.
Social custom often determines how we behave. The capability for good may in fact be the predominant built-in mode, but we can be corrupted.
Corrupted by
social pressure, by all kinds of constraints that society, or by lack of resources.
And as you say, if you see someone in pain, you feel pain. But if you see someone angry, you start to feel defensive.
And respond.
Good behavior around you can elicit positive behavior in yourself. Problematic behavior around you can elicit problematic behavior in yourself.
Right.
Those are
one of the points I want to highlight is that a lot of the mechanisms that we're talking about for social perception can be used for good or ill. So I can try to understand other people's intentions because I want to help them, and we hope that most of the time that's what's going on. But these very same mechanisms are extremely powerful if I want to compete with them. And so, if the car dealership and you're trying to stare down the dealer and figure out, the best price in the car. You see in middle school, for example, a period where children try out all of these mechanisms of social perception. You see a great deal of bullying and aggression, and I think of it as the same underlying brain systems being used in different ways and interacting with learning and what's appropriate and what's not, and also being regulated by other brain systems to do the right things instead of using these same mechanisms for figuring out how to do harm to other people, which they're just as good at.
Implicitly what you're saying, I'm just restating what you're saying, is that these systems for social action are in turn controlled by other systems that are open to a variety of social pressures that can convert them from one goal to another.
Exactly. And so, for example, when you talk about the switch with stress, now you're using this system to figure out the best way, to land a punch.
In terms of difficulty and in terms of where we are in understanding the social brain, is it the one where we know the least, the most? Is it the one where there are more questions?
I think that's a difficult question to answer. I think that it's amazing how much we've learned in a short period of time. So I would say that going from a relatively limited understanding, we've moved a long way. Now, we don't understand social behavior as well as we understand visual processing. Right. But people have been studying visual processing on a profound level for a very long time, considering the fact that the number of people working on social behavior is more restricted and a relatively shorter period of time. I think the progress has been remarkable. Moreover, as Jerry indicated, if you take the major diseases that haunt mankind, schizophrenia, depression, bipolar disorder, autism, I think we've got a lead in autism that the other disorders do not have. That is, we have both an anatomical understanding and the beginning of trying to get at the appropriate genes, including the idea that there are de novo mutations, which in part came out of these studies. So I think we're doing quite well. None of these problems are going to be solved in the next 10 or 20 years, but we really have a strong beginning in getting a good understanding of autism and social disorders.
I always ask two questions. What do you want us to take away from this in sort of an essence, and what is the one question you hope that we can answer in the near term?
Charlie, what I want to take away is the notion that the biology is profound and that we really have good handles to understand it, but always appreciating that there's an element of indeterminism here and of learning and plasticity and a great deal of hope in learning about the biological mechanisms, because the real hope is they will be able to be used to alter pathological states. And there's very good hints now in animal models of developmental disorders that once you do have a handle on some of the important genetic influences, although it's not a sure thing, you may have a shot at reversing some of these phenomena. So my hope in leaving and thinking about this is that we will begin to understand how the genetics and the physical properties of the brain influence these important social cognitive phenomena. I think it's going to be more complicated than we think. It won't be may not be strictly localized to one region of the brain. The brain is an information machine, and we have to learn how that information is processed. But I think that it will be disorders like autism and related disorders that lead us to a deeper understanding of who we are as humans.
Kevin?
Well, I think one of the things that I want everyone to take away is something actually that we didn't really talk much about, but I think will come up
I asked the question.
In a future segment, and that's really a developmental perspective on all this. So the reason why autism is such a profoundly difficult thing to understand is development. We're talking about a neurodevelopmental disorder, and things are changing constantly, and we have to take all that into account. And the question I want to address in the medium to short term is, I think we're in a position where we have an understanding from genetics, both clinical genetics and work in other organisms and from non-human primates, and we can take that information into human neuroimaging, and we can begin to understand the very early development of the social brain and why different social brains develop differently. In the extreme, why does a social brain develop in the direction of autism? And with that knowledge, then we can design rational, scientifically informed treatment approaches that would alter social brain development and then ultimately alter the course of autism. And so, I hope that occurs and as quickly as possible.
Well, I don't know if you notice it. Here we discuss it on one side of mechanism, like mirror mirror neurons. So you understand something in terms of mechanism. On the other hand, we have not spoken so much about theory of mind. So it's interesting that we have the explanation of autism and the other diseases or of social behavior in terms of psychological terms, like theory of mind. So my dream will be to explain this psychological term in terms of mechanism, because then the link with genetics became much more easier and obvious. Because if we say, well, the theory of mind is wrong, it's not going well in autism, in a sense, we repeat what Kanner described in a more elegant way.
But is there reason to believe that some of the things that you're identifying are steps in understanding?
Exactly. It's a step, exactly. But my dream is to arrive to a step in which I say theory of mind is because it's the following mechanism. It's because neuron A does something, not simply theory of mind. It's the same as Kanner said. It's
but theory of mind means what?
Theory of mind refers to the fact that when you and I have a conversation, I have a general idea of where you're going, what you hope to get at, that you have your own way of thinking about a problem. Autistic kids can't get into your brain. They don't understand that you have your own agenda, which is different than their agenda.
This is a very profound issue. It's a matter of belief. When do children develop an idea about false beliefs, that other people may believe things that are different than what they believe? It's different than a shared emotion. A young child will smile when you smile, or they'll frown when you frown, but to appreciate that the person you're looking at may be thinking about something that's different than what you're thinking about is a very late developing and very profound skill.
And a key concept that can relate back to aggression is understanding that another person's belief may be different from yours and different from what you know to be reality, at least your belief of what reality is. When those two things disagree, that's an opportunity for conflict.
The point to take away is that our brains are not calculators where you punch in a bunch of numbers and you get a number out at the end. Our brains are ourselves, and they incorporate what's important and how we feel, and they give you different kinds of responses. And one of the most important things for us is each other. From the moment of our birth, the most important aspect of our life is our ability to predict and affect the behavior of others. And so this is a big part of what it is to be human. And I would say that the question I would like to understand is how a biological system can do something so remarkable.
Yes, well said. Eric?
I think there's sort of two themes that struck me that have come out of this discussion. One is how important it is for biology, for our understanding, of using a number of different experimental approaches, including different organisms, varying complexity from worms to non-human primates to people. I think this is essential, this comparative approach that is critical to understanding behavior, number one. And number two, given the fact that we're born to do good, as Giacomo would have us believe, but we're capable of evil, to understand better how one flips from one to the other, and to see whether we can prevent this tribalism from becoming a dominant force. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we had some biological insight into how to contain that?
So there you have it, an insight into the social brain next month.
So the next month we're going to consider the developing brain. We're going to look at how do kids acquire language? To what degree is this innate? To what degree is this learning? How do they acquire other skills? How do they acquire mathematical ability? How do they develop the ability to tell space? How do logical processes develop? So we're going to look at all of these things. Also, we're going to see that there are a number of these modules of cognitive development that can be impaired by different diseases. So we're going to look at a Fragile X, with Rett syndrome, a number of really important disorders that affect different aspects of intellectual development in kids.
I can't wait.